Today is July 26, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I want to talk about the ongoing Ukrainian offensive, which is now nearing the 2-month mark. I want to start as usual by looking at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map, so keep that in mind as we look at it. And as we zoom in and we look along the line of contact, and this is where Ukraine has been focusing its offensive here in Kherson and Zaporozhye, and also around Bakhmut. As you can see, the line of contact remains almost virtually unchanged after almost 2 months of fighting, 2 months of offensives. And we see these the blue rifle icon, but also red rifle icons, and that means there are attacks ongoing. Maybe no territory has traded hands, but both Ukrainian and also Russian forces are launching offensive attacks. Here, outside of Donetsk, we see the red rifle icons. This is a pro-Ukrainian live map admitting that Russian forces are on the offensive, and in some areas, we could see the rifle icons are quite far from what is claimed to be Russian-held territory, and there has been advances allegedly made in or around Kharkov, where Ukraine's fall offensive last year ended. I have not seen any confirmation of this on the pro-Ukrainian map, but I have heard and seen this news on Telegram from pro-Russian channels. This is a situation we'll have to keep an eye on. I highly recommend people follow the Duran, both Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mikuris. They both do daily updates on the situation in Ukraine, and they have been covering the front lines very closely. Also on this live map, actually, let's go back to the live map and take a look. They aren't there right now, but there were attacks reported in Crimea. There were also attacks reported in Moscow over the last 2 or 3 days. And these are drone attacks, most likely. Perhaps a Storm Shadow missile in Crimea. I'm still waiting to get the information about the details of those attacks. But these are attacks being carried out not for any sort of tactical or strategic purpose, but solely for public relations value. And this fits in with the recent attack on the Crimean Bridge. We have an article from CNN right here. It says, Ukrainian defense minister says attacks on Crimea will continue, predicts NATO entry early next year. And what he's talking about is Ukraine joining NATO early next year. Highly unlikely, but I want to talk about his comments about attacking the Crimea and the Crimean Bridge specifically. So it says Ukraine's defense minister Alexei Reznikov says that Ukraine will continue carrying out attacks on Russian-occupied Crimea and the Kerch Bridge that connects it to the Russian mainland, while also admitting that Ukraine's plan for its sluggish counteroffensive is behind schedule. Quite obvious. As Russia has pummeled the southern port city of Odessa and the surrounding region over the past week, Ukraine has continued to carry out strikes inside Crimea. On Tuesday, Ukrainian drones hit an ammunition depot just a week after seaborne drones struck the Kerch Bridge. Then it says, all these targets, now they're quoting Reznikov, all these targets are official targets because it will reduce the capacity to fight against us and will help to save the lives of Ukrainians, Reznikov said in an interview with CNN. Asked if Ukraine's goal is to permanently disable the bridge, Reznikov responded, it's normal tactics to ruin the logistic lines of your enemy, to stop the options to get more ammunition, to get more fuel, to get more food, etc. That's why we will use these tactics against them. So he's saying, yes, we're going to try to completely disable the bridge. Now, an ammunition depot, yes, that is a military target. The Crimean Bridge, and more specifically the roadways, these are not military targets. That is purely civilian traffic moving across the roadways. You could make an argument for the rail bridge. That has in the past been used to move military equipment to the Crimean Peninsula. But the roadways are not a military target. I've gone in great depth about how The Crimean Peninsula was returned to Russia in 2014. The bridge across the Kerch Strait was not completed until 2018, and it was only as recently as 2022 that Russia established the land bridge. So before that, Russia depended entirely on sea and air logistics to supply both its military facilities on the Crimean Peninsula and also the civilian population. Destroying this bridge and cutting the land bridge is not going to isolate Crimea. It's a fantasy. It cannot happen. And Reznikov and the rest of the Ukrainian government, they understand that. They understand this notion of isolating Crimea by cutting the Crimean bridge and also the land bridge. That is a fantasy. That will never work. The reason they're attacking the Crimean bridge is because it's a very visible symbol. And by attacking it, it's relatively vulnerable. And by attacking it, they can score public relations points. That's what it's all about. They killed 2 parents and injured their daughter just to score public relation points. This was never going to seriously affect Russian military logistics. And they know that. The Russian government is claiming that the attack on the Crimean bridge is terrorism. These drone strikes that are hitting residential buildings and commercial buildings, that is terrorism. They're calling it terrorism. And I would agree that it is terrorism because it is violence being used to advance a political agenda. It is detached from self-defense. And even if you want to argue that propaganda in and of itself is part of Ukraine's defensive strategy in the special military operation, in order for it to be justified, it has to have some sort of likelihood of succeeding, and it doesn't. So it is just senseless violence, killing civilians just to score points in headlines, Western media headlines. And they're doing this targeting the Crimean bridge, sending drones into Moscow, knowing full well that it's going to change absolutely nothing on the battlefield, because on the battlefield, their offensive is not making any strategic advances and very few tactical advances. And the CNN article actually even admits this. It says Ukraine's grueling counteroffensive has not resulted in any significant breakthroughs. Remember, we are almost at the 2-month mark, despite Western allies donating billions of dollars worth of aid to bolster Kiev's military might and putting hundreds of soldiers through training. I think it was closer to thousands of soldiers. Reznikov, however, insisted the operation is going to plan, saying, our generals, our commanders, they see the real situation on the battlefield. And again, I have to repeat, the main value for us is life of our soldiers. But asked if the plan is behind schedule, he acknowledged that it is. And we have to remember that the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Oleksiy Reznikov, he has said things like this previously about, say, Bakhmut. Like, it was not going to fall. They were going to hold it. Russian forces have spent their offensive potential. They would not be able to take the city, and yet now Russia holds Bakhmut. The article also talks about U.S. supplied cluster munitions. These are the 155 millimeter artillery shells being used by Ukraine because the US and their allies are out of conventional artillery shells to send Ukraine. They do not have enough. And I've pointed out that time is of the essence for this offensive. It means everything for Ukraine. Every single day, regardless of whether Ukraine is making progress on the battlefield or not, they're expending artillery rounds. They're also wearing down their guns. They're also losing their guns as Russia finds them, targets them, and either damages or destroys them. The same goes for Ukraine's armor, their main battle tanks, their armored personnel carriers, their infantry fighting vehicles. These are being used daily. They are facing heavy use. They are wearing down. They require maintenance. They're also being damaged and destroyed as the fighting unfolds. All of this is having an accumulative effect. If and when Ukraine breaks through the security zone, or as some call it, the gray zone, and they reach the first of several Russian defensive lines, they're going to have far less available to them in terms of artillery, in terms of armor, in terms of trained manpower to consolidate these gains and then exploit them to break through these successive defensive lines. It doesn't matter where Ukrainian forces end on the map. Wherever they end, they will end exhausted. And they will end there exhausted without NATO being able to rebuild their army yet again. This would be the fourth army that the US and its allies would have to create and transfer over to Ukraine. And for those not keeping track, the US built up Ukraine's military from 2014, after the US orchestrated regime change in Kiev, all the way up until 2022, when Russia began its special military operation. That was the first army the US helped Ukraine organize. It was decimated during the opening phases of the special military operation. The West then transferred equipment, began training soldiers ahead of the fall offensive in 2022. That offensive was carried out in Kherson and Kharkov. Those forces were also decimated. And then from the end of the fall offensive last year up until June, early June this year, when Ukraine launched its next large offensive, a whole other army's worth of equipment and trained manpower was created or transferred over to Ukraine. And now we're watching that army be decimated on the battlefield. Now, I want to take a look at this Politico article. Ukrainian offensive was delayed by lack of munitions, Zelensky says. The Ukrainian president acknowledged that the delay allowed Russia to strengthen its defenses. And what Politico is saying is that Ukraine didn't get enough equipment, they didn't get it fast enough, and all at the same time Russia was growing stronger. This is why the offensive is at least not succeeding. It hasn't officially failed yet, but it is not succeeding. This is what the article said. It said, Ukraine had hoped to start its highly anticipated counteroffensive earlier in the spring, but held off because it lacked the necessary weapons, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said. We did have plans to start it in spring, but we didn't because, frankly, we had not enough munitions and armament and not enough brigades properly trained in these weapons. Still more than the training missions were held outside Ukraine, Zelensky said in an interview that aired on CNN's Farid Zakaria GPS. Because the counteroffensive began later, Zelensky said, speaking through a translator, it provided Russia with time to mine all our lands and build several lines of defense. And definitely they had even more time than they needed. Because of that, they built more and more of those lines. And really, they had a lot of mines in our fields. Because of that, a slower pace of our counteroffensive actions. We didn't want to lose our people, our personnel, and our servicemen didn't want to lose equipment. Because of that, he told Zakaria. Now, this wouldn't have made any difference. It's clear that whether the offensive began in the spring or a few months later in the summer, it was not going to succeed. They not only didn't have enough equipment, they didn't have the right equipment. They don't have air power. They don't have sufficient air defenses. They don't have a sufficient amount of artillery or armor. They would have needed many times more of everything that they have now, plus systems they don't have right now. I've talked about the minefields, and in order to breach minefields, you need to clear the enemy on the other side of the minefield, who will be firing at you if you don't, while you try to clear the minefield. Ukraine does not have the capability to do that, so they go and attempt to clear the minefield, and they're being fired upon the entire time. It's hard enough to clear a minefield without being shot at. Ukraine is being shot at, and that's why we are watching piles of NATO armor burn in heaps in these minefields. And this is not a result of political willpower. This is a result of military-industrial output. Russia has its military-industrial output prepared for this type of conflict. The collective West does not. Now, I pointed this out before, and I'm going to point it out again just to make this point. This is from Novaya Gazeta. This is a pro-Western, anti-Russian media platform. And this article from November 2022, the barren barrels, Russia's military industry has all sorts of problems. There are barely any details for tanks, aircraft, electronics, and newest missiles are in short supply. Well, I think at this point we all know that whatever information they were going off of to draw these conclusions was inaccurate. Russia has plenty of missiles. They are not running out of missiles as predicted in articles like this. But there's something else very interesting in this article. It admits, buried deep in the article, Russia's tank industry is currently capable of producing up to 250 new vehicles and modernizing up to 600 old ones each year. 250 new tanks, 600 modernized tanks. And just to give you an idea of what they're talking about, one of the newest main battle tanks Russia has, most advanced, widely produced, is the T-90M. This is a modernized version of the T-90 tank. As you can see here, it has essentially the latest optics, gun, fire control system, armor, and engine that Russia could put in a mass-produced tank. Yes, they have the T-14 Armata, but that is still being tested. This is the most modern production tank Russia has at the moment. What do they mean by modernizing? So this would be new tanks that they would be building, or modernizing older T-90s. What about modernizing older tanks other than T-90? There's the T-72B3M. And the T-72B3M would have the same gun, engine, fire control system, optics, and other specifications of the T-90M. So it's almost exactly like a T-90M, only much cheaper because they didn't have to build it from scratch. So that's 850 tanks, modern main battle tanks, rolling onto the battlefield every single year. And those production numbers were pre-special military operation. I guarantee you that they are building many more tanks and modernizing many more tanks now. Apparently, the Vaya Gazeta was attempting to make this number of 850 tanks seem small for some reason. But for contrast, here's another article also from Army Recognition, a very good resource, by the way. The links to all of this will be in the video description below. This is a list of the 808 tanks that Ukraine will have received from NATO allies, with a part already delivered. And they're talking about, as of April 28, 2023, more than 98% of the combat vehicles promised to Ukraine have already been delivered. That means over 1,550 armored vehicles, 230 main battle tanks, and other equipment, including vast amounts of ammunition. According to Army Recognition editorial team count, Ukraine will receive 808 main battle tanks. And then they're talking about the additional tanks that Ukraine would be receiving ahead of the big offensive. So 808 tanks transferred over by the West to Ukraine since the beginning of the special military operation, and Russia producing 850 tanks. That is a pre-special military operation number, production number. It is surely higher. Russian tanks benefit from a streamlined logistics, training, and maintenance pipeline for Ukraine, with this hodgepodge, again, this hodgepodge of different, just main battle tanks alone, is going to complicate training, logistics, and maintenance. You will need different maintenance crews to maintain each and every one of these, different logistics to supply them with fuel, spare parts, and ammunition, and different training for the operators of the tanks. Each one is unique and will require a different training program. And you cannot do this in the middle of a war and not suffer the consequences. So they're getting less, and they're getting less actual tanks, but a wider variety of actual tanks. I'm emphasizing this again just to point out how difficult it is for the West to supply Ukraine with weapons, with ammunition, and how difficult it will be for the West to generate essentially a fourth army's worth of equipment and trained manpower. They struggle to prepare Ukraine for this offensive. The offensive is failing. It is going to be even more difficult the next round. Speaking of logistics, the U.S. Department of Defense on July 19, 2023, announced an additional security assistance package for Ukraine. But as you can see, this is part of the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. That means that this announcement represents the beginning of a contracting process to provide additional priority capabilities to Ukraine. And it's everything listed here. NASAMS, 152 millimeter artillery rounds, mine clearing equipment, tube launched optical tracked, wire guided, essentially TOW, anti-tank missiles, Phoenix, Ghost, and Switchblade unmanned aerial systems. I have not heard anything at all about these in terms of effectiveness on the battlefield. Precision aerial munitions, counter UAS and electronic warfare detection equipment, 150 fuel trucks, 115 tactical vehicles to tow and haul equipment, 50 tactical vehicles to recover equipment, port and harbor security equipment, tactical secure communication systems, support for training, maintenance, and sustainment activities. All things that sound like they would have been very useful before Ukraine's current offensive. Things that now cannot be drawn from the US's existing stockpiles, but a contract has to be drawn up. And only when the contract is completed will production begin, and then it could be months, if not a year or more, before any of this ever reaches Ukraine. And then not long after that was announced, we got this from Reuters. This is July 22nd. U.S. to give Ukraine new $400 million military aid package. Now, this is actually from the presidential drawdown. This is coming from existing stockpiles. And it says here, munitions for NASAMS, munitions for HIMARS, anti-tank weapons, including TOW and Javelin, and munitions for Patriot and Stinger anti-aircraft systems. They're not mentioning any quantities. They've stopped doing that a long time ago because after the initial very significant tranches that they sent to Ukraine, they essentially ran out. And so they're scraping together whatever they can find and they're sending it to Ukraine. If those initial massive tranches made no difference, these smaller packages that they put together, all it's doing is delaying the inevitable. It cannot change the outcome of this conflict. This is exactly what the United States did in Syria. It's proxy war against the government in Damascus. It could never create an army that could match or exceed the capabilities of the Syrian Arab army and its allies, which included Russian military forces. It could never do that. What it did instead was just constantly flood the country with weapons and militants. They were never properly trained. They could not organize. They could not carry out large-scale military operations. But they did create a security quagmire for Syria and its allies. And it is a quagmire that exists to this day. It's a quagmire that Syria and its allies are resolving, but it's a quagmire that has persisted for years nonetheless. And that is what the United States is going to attempt to achieve in Ukraine if they feel that some sort of more direct intervention is impossible. Now, since we're talking about weapon shipments, why not talk about this Politico article here? China secretly sends enough gear to Russia to equip an army. Shipments of military-capable hardware expose a China-sized loophole in Western sanctions. And a lot of people who saw this headline and didn't bother to read the article just assumed that this is China secretly arming the Russian military amid its special military operation. But that is not what's going on here. So first they talk about bulletproof vests and helmets being sold by a private company in China to Russian troops. And then it says, evidence of this kind shows that China, despite Beijing's call for peace, is pushing right up to the red line in delivering enough non-lethal but militarily useful equipment to Russia to have a material impact on President Vladimir Putin's 17th-month-old war on Ukraine. The protective gear would be sufficient to equip many of the men mobilized by Russia since the invasion. Then there are drones that can be used to direct artillery fire or drop grenades, and thermal optic sights to target the enemy at night. Then it says, these shipments point to a China-sized loophole in the West's attempts to hobble Putin's war machine. The sale of so-called dual-use technology that can have both civilian and military uses leaves just enough deniability for Western authorities looking for reasons not to confront a huge economic power like Beijing. Well, first of all, the US and EU sanctions on Russia are unilateral and meaningless under international law. That's one thing that's very important to understand. And number two, even this Politico article mentions very briefly that Ukraine is also buying bulletproof vests, helmets, and drones from China, from the very same company. It says that Ukraine is receiving the exact same equipment, but just in smaller quantities, but they never explain why that is. There is no limit on how much Ukraine can buy from these private companies based in China. But what they try to do instead is just imply that the Chinese government somehow is secretly arming Russia, that their push for peace is disingenuous, and that they shouldn't be allowed to have any sort of role. Not just that, but they're also implying that last sentence that I read, that the West should impose sanctions on China now. And this is actually part of a much wider and concerted media campaign. This isn't journalism or news. This is war propaganda. There's articles like this from CNN. This was from March 2023. Exclusive: Chinese-made drone retrofitted and weaponized down in eastern Ukraine. And the article suggests that this Mujin 5 Chinese-made drone was being used by the Russians. But if you do some digging, you will see that it's also being used by the Ukrainians. As a matter of fact, this is from The Drive. This is also from March 2023. And it says, our best look at Ukraine's shadowy Alibaba drone used for long-range strikes. And there it is, the Mujin 5 drone that they claimed Russia was using. Ukraine is also using it. We also have articles like this from the BBC, April 2023. Ukraine rapidly expanding its army of drones for the front. And if you search DJI, the most common drone seen on the front line is the DJI Mavic, which costs less than $2,000 US. Last year, its Chinese manufacturer banned export to Ukraine and Russia, insisting its products are for civilian use only. They say that the ban has made it harder to get hold of the drones, but Ukraine still has been able to import thousands. I just wanted to point this out. This Politico article and many others like it are attempting to portray China as secretly arming Russia. But when you read the details of these articles, it's clearly private enterprises in China that make just about everything on Earth, and they sell it to everyone on Earth. And both Russians and Ukrainians are buying these products and using them on the battlefield. It has nothing to do with the Chinese government, and it actually has very little to do with these Chinese companies, because even if they could stop Russians and Ukrainians from buying it directly, others would buy it and send it to them. And that's exactly what's been going on. Washington and their allies are going to be thinking about what their next move will be. They've played this card, the offensive, it didn't materialize. They're going to be looking for the next card to play. Is it going to be some sort of intervention, a buffer zone in Western Ukraine? Or are they going to abandon this conflict and focus fully on the war they're trying to provoke with China in the Pacific? I don't know. We need to keep a very close eye on this. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing to my channel. It's free to do, and it helps the channel grow. Please check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. In the video description below are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad for some reason pops up, feel free to skip it. It doesn't do me any good. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. That is what makes this work possible. And as always, thank you for watching.